Let's go ahead and create our first MVC application by clicking on File, New Project. Make sure you are working with Visual C#. Click on Web, and then you want to choose the ASP.NET Web Application. Also make sure that you're choosing at least the 4.51 .NET Framework. This will mean that you're working with MVC5. Go ahead and give it a name. We'll call it My First MVC. And click on OK. Now if you also notice, it says Create Directory for Solution. If we have wanted to, we could have went ahead and created a solution first and then added a project to the solution. But we'll go ahead and let Visual Studio do both steps for us. We then choose that we want an MVC. Notice that when we choose MVC, it automatically selects MVC down in the folders and core references. We do not need to turn on the Add Unit Test. And make sure you are looking at a website and click on OK. It then goes and creates its first MVC application and generates all the files and folders you need in order to run it. Now the nice thing about choosing the MVC is that Visual Studio will create a template for you, more or less like a starting ground for your web application. In fact, let's go ahead and run this. The way you run it is by clicking on the green arrow, and if I clicked on the down arrow, I could see that there's different browsers I could use. Yours might be using Internet Explorer by default. Just go ahead and choose Chrome, Firefox, whichever you prefer, and use that one. I'm going to use Chrome, and I'm going to click on the arrow to start it. It opens up my browser, and it's going to display my MVC application. I did nothing to do this. Microsoft did it all for me, and there it is. We have a home page, we have an about page, and a contact page. There's our about page, our contact page, our home name or our home page. There's the application name. We have a register link that we can click on. We have a login link that we can click on. Go back to home. We can actually click on other links here, and they're all functional. The nice thing about this is it gives you a good head start that if you wanted to use this, you could then go and modify it, and Visual Studio's already laid out the groundwork for you. Let's go ahead and close that website, and then we come back to Visual Studio, and I want you to notice something. That project is actually still running. So in order for you to make any changes, you need to come back and click on this red square right there, and that will stop the running of the application. Let's take a look at what got generated for us. First thing I'm going to do is close the output window just to see the screen a little bit better. And the first thing I select is my project, my first MVC. And if you look down below, you see there's actually properties associated with that project. I can actually also click on properties here, click on the arrow to expand it, and below it we have what they call the assembly info CS file. This file was automatically generated for you and contains what we call the IL code, or intermediate language code, and it's similar to Java bytecode. But the nice thing about using this file is it contains information about the assembly, about your project. There's the assembly title, the description, configuration, company, all this information about the assembly. The nice thing about keeping it in this file is instead of keeping it in multiple files and having to change multiple files, I have one file that describes my assembly. I could actually come into here and change it and say this project is my first MVC app. That's now a nice description for this assembly, and I can actually pull that information out later on in my code using Razor syntax. The next folder that's created for you is called References. I can expand that, and this folder simply contains all of the assemblies or DLLs that are referenced by our project. The next folder is called App Data, and this would contain the actual data files that we're going to be using in our project. The folder after that is App Start. It contains the bundle config CS, filter config, identity config, route config, and startup.auth.cs files. And this is new in MVC5. These files all specify different configurations for helping your ASP.NET application run. Some identify routes, some identify that you can use jQuery, CSS, things like that. The next folder is called your content folder. and that contains things like your CSS files, images, and the interesting thing is, look, by default MVC 5 automatically brings in Bootstrap and uses that within your application. You'll learn more about Bootstrap throughout the course. The next folder is called your controllers folder. By default, it actually creates a couple controllers for you, and remember, the controller is the go-between between the model where the data is and the view, which is where your HTML or what you're looking at. It's more or less like the manager. It controls the business rules for the application. Then you have a folder that has any fonts that you might be using. Another folder that contains any models that you're using. Remember, models are representative of the data. Scripts, this is where you'd have all your JavaScript that you might write or bring in. And once again, notice Bootstrap's brought in, jQuery's brought in. Those are nice things that MVC 5 is doing automatically for you. This last folder is called Views, and the Views is actually the GUI or the user interface that they'll see when they access the website, and they're just HTML files. Along with the views, we have a view start CS HTML. The CS stands for C# and HTML, and this is where you could define a common template or layout for all of the views to share. The next file is web config, and that web config specifically works with the views, and it's a way that you can define the views and how they're going to work. Then we have a favicon.ico file, and that's the icon that's used for your application. We have a global.asax file. This file is also known as the ASP.NET application file. This file is used to respond to events either raised by MVC or by HTTP. You'll learn more about that throughout the semester. The next file is called packages.config, and this actually specifies any packages that your application needs. The project.readme.html file is the file that we actually see when we run the application. You'll probably be able to delete that file or change that file. Then we have the startup.cs file. The startup.cs file, this file actually contains a class called startup, and it's working with an OWIN application. The OWIN, that stands for Open Web Interface Application. And you'll learn more about OWIN and OAuth when we get into security. The last file that gets created is our web config. I want you to notice that we have a web config already, but it's under the views folder. It specifies how the views are working, whereas this web config is located, and I have to scroll up and I'll minimize a lot of these folders so we can actually have a better view of it. But you'll notice that it actually resides underneath the project itself. And this file specifies more or less like a configuration for the project. One of the nice things that we'll be working with is the connection strings. And this is where we specify connection strings for our project to work with data and data files. Those are the files that get created for you. We'll understand these a lot more as we start working with them. But the nice thing is to let .NET help you get your job done, and at least help you when you're first starting off learning the application.